All right, well, let's get started. So welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many faces. This is probably the biggest Zoom meeting that I've been in recently, so it's terrific to see all of you. Of course, this is the session on the UChicago law clinics and responses to COVID-19. Obviously, legal practice has changed pretty fundamentally in recent months with social distancing, lots of institutions closing down. But legal work continues, and our clinics have been, of course, continuing, and in some ways have been busier than ever. So we've had some amazing work done by our students and by our clinical faculty on COVID-19 issues, and this session is really just to share some of that with you all. So we've got a full agenda. We are recording the session, so we can post it later to the law school social media outlets. We have a full agenda, so we're going to jump right in. We should still have plenty of time at the end for a Q&A session. So I'm going to turn it over to our first clinic for discussion, which is the Abrams Environmental Law Clinic.
Great. So I'm Mark Templeton. Rob Weinstock and I teach the Environmental Law Clinic. And I'm just going to turn it over at this point to Camille Sipple, a second-year student, and Olivia Cusimano, a third-year student, who have been leading our work in Michigan in an environmental justice community right in the Detroit area, and to talk about how COVID-19 has been impacting some of our legal work and advocacy.
Hi, so
yeah, can you screen share, Olivia, or do you need me to do that?
Yes, I think I'm working, or I think I can get it to work. Let's see. Does this look to be working?
Looks good to me. Thank you.
Perfect. Great. Yeah, so today Camille and I are going to talk about our work with the Michigan Public Service Commission, or our work on behalf of our client Solidarity for the Michigan Public Service Commission, and how they're handling the COVID-19 pandemic. So without further ado, our client Solidarity is based in Highland Park, Michigan, which is a neighborhood, or like kind of a township, its own independent township from Detroit, but it's entirely surrounded by Detroit. It's a really low income area. The median income is something like $16,000 a year. The organization got started because DTE, the electric company that serves the area, actually ripped out many of their street lighting, and they had to sort of self-fund and get things sort of organized to fix that. They also have a lot of issues surrounding reliability and just cost of service for the utilities. So primarily their work is to try and move toward community-owned solar and just push generally, or advocate generally, for their constituents to have fair and equitable power. So we work with Jackson Coppell. He's the director, and he fortunately is really leading the charge for the commission to address COVID-19. So I'll now turn it over to Camille to talk a little, oh, come on. Oh, there we go. A little about what we've been working on.
Hi guys. So one of the first things that we worked on with Jackson in the context of the pandemic is a letter to the utility asking for certain relief for the constituents that he works with. So Solidarity and Work for Me, another nonprofit group, basically wrote to the commission to ask them to issue a directive to the utilities regarding how they would handle the COVID state of emergency. We talked a lot about how these customers would be able to pay their bills during this time, making the fees go away, making it a longer payment period. It was really important that we stress that people who are ill or are at home and already have food insecurity really don't need their electricity being shut off to lose the food that they do have. Or if they are already using medical equipment, not having that medical equipment turned on could be matters of life and death. And so the first big step that we took with the COVID pandemic was to write that letter, and the commission responded, which I will turn over to Olivia.
Yeah, so then what's kind of cool about this is whether or not the letter was the complete impetus behind this, we do think that it had an impact on the Michigan Public Service Commission actually issuing a binding order that was outlining steps that the commission has taken to address COVID-19, as well as it essentially forces the utility companies to affirm that they are taking steps, I guess, individually as utility companies to protect their company or their customers and make sure that, you know, things are not completely unstable for those who are facing serious problems. So basically, they focus really highly on low income as well as those who have actually fallen sick as a result of COVID. And the really cool thing about it that we're kind of looking into getting involved in now is that they ask for a lot of input on how to deal with this from a policy perspective, primarily because, you know, they've never seen anything like this before. Everybody's kind of in this together newly. So to be able to have a stake in how this goes in or how the utilities might respond to not just this crisis, but other like sort of unprecedented crises that may occur in the future, be them weather related or anything else, is really important. And we're really excited to be able to get involved in that. The order is binding, so everything that they say in it is like a judicial judgment. This is just take a like really quick step back. All of our work is before an administrative law judge, and then the commission takes the ALJ's recommendation and kind of issues an order that is binding law. So it's slightly different than normal litigation proceedings. So we were really happy to see this because it really does kind of, I guess, for lack of a better word, force the utilities to do something, which is what we've been asking to do all year in one way or another.
So maybe, yeah, I was gonna say, maybe before we run out of our time, we take just 30 seconds on the next slide. Does that work?
Yes, I was just about to say, I'm going to turn it over to Camille to talk a little bit about the rate case in general. Great.
So just to wrap it up, we had a case ongoing for the last year or so, which addressed how the utility money gets kind of dispersed. And so we were actually writing the exceptions to this case during kind of the COVID pandemic breakout. And so we actually made some of these arguments within the case that we had made previously, but it helped us emphasize our points. So we talked a lot about the pronounced vulnerability of those who have already received an equitable inferior service and why the importance of a reliable and affordable energy is so important, not just now, but when emergencies like this come up. We argued that the utility is really better able to shoulder those burdens and should, and we went to the commission and asked them to hold DTE, the utility, accountable for their actions during this time. So it's really interesting how it has affected our cases that we have been arguing for a very long time as well.
Great. Thank you, Olivia and Camille. And I'm sure many of you have just seen how Detroit was particularly hit hard during the last economic recession, seen stories about how it's been hit really hard with COVID-19. Water utilities were getting shut off. This fits into a broader economic and environmental justice context as well. So thanks for giving us the opportunity to share.
Thank you. That was terrific. Next, can we hear from the Exoneration Project?
Thanks, Jeff. So the Exoneration Project, obviously our goal in normal times is to try to get innocent people out of prison. And that's taken on a much greater sense of urgency right now, given how catastrophic the effects of COVID have been in a correctional setting. Cook County Jail for a while was the largest cluster of coronavirus cases in the entire country. Last I heard, they're up to 7 deaths. They had a correctional officer who passed away from it as well. Hundreds of cases. Illinois Department of Corrections similarly has had a number of deaths and hundreds of cases. So we've been doing everything we can, both in court and through other remedies such as action by the governor or appealing to the Department of Corrections itself to try to get people out of prison. So Ann Thorson, she's a 3L, she's going to talk about one of our cases, a guy named Donald Lucas, a client of ours, and what we did on his behalf.
Yeah, so in the late 90s, Donald Lucas was convicted in an attempted murder case. And so we ended up filing a post-conviction petition that claimed actual innocence and ineffective assistance of counsel. And this past November, we had an evidentiary hearing on it. Myself and another 3L, Megan Tobit, both had the opportunity to put on witnesses at this hearing. And essentially these witnesses kind of came together to say that our client, Donald Lucas, was not physically or psychologically capable of committing the crime. And then the judge had us come back in late February to do his ruling. And this should be noted that the state actually put on a pretty vigorous defense to this. Sometimes they just let these things kind of go or they drop it, but they crossed our witnesses and they put together some pretty good arguments. And then the judge came back in February and said, this was the worst crime he had ever seen in all of his years on the bench, but he believed that we put on enough evidence that our client was innocent. So he vacated the conviction. And then that day, actually, Donald Lucas was sent from the Illinois Department of Corrections to Cook County Jail, and that's kind of where Carl can take over on the bail stuff.
Thanks, Ann. So, and Ann did a great job at the hearing, put on a witness, did a great job. We asked the judge the day that he vacated the conviction to keep Donald in the Illinois Department of Corrections because it has slightly better ability to handle people with medical conditions, which Donald has, including asthma and a number of underlying conditions, which we thought he would get better treatment for in the Illinois Department of Corrections. Like Ann said, this was in February. Coronavirus was a thing that was out there, but not something that was really as critical yet. So we asked that he remain in Illinois Department of Corrections. The judge said, no, I vacated his conviction. He goes to the jail, moved him to the jail. So then we moved for bail. We were denied in the first instance. Then we filed after the coronavirus became a much more dire threat to him. We filed another emergency motion for bond. We're denied again. And then we ended up finding an expert witness who wrote an opinion for us saying that given all of Donald's underlying medical conditions, if he were to contract it, he would have maybe a 25% chance of living, 75% chance of dying. And even if he lived, would be on a ventilator for a long time, using up resources that could maybe be used for somebody other than a prisoner. So we went back to the judge again for a third time in an emergency thing at 26th in California, the main criminal courthouse, which was sort of a surreal environment because everybody had to wear masks. Only lawyers were allowed. Defendants couldn't be there unless they were unrepresented. Out of all the courtrooms, they only had 2 open. And you do the argument sitting up on opposite ends of the courtroom. It was just a very odd environment. The state put on, again, a vigorous opposition to letting him out, including the state's attorney somehow arguing that Donald's risk of dying was the exact same as the state's attorney's 87-year-old mother, which was a strange argument to make. But eventually the judge agreed to let him out, and he's home now, living with his sister, and does not have coronavirus. So that was one of our successes. We faced mostly frustration in getting people out, but that's sort of an example of what we've been doing on the court side. And then in terms of what we've been doing on the executive side, appealing to the governor and appealing to the Department of Corrections, another one of our lawyers, Lauren Meyer Muller, is going to fill us in on that.
Hi, everyone. So Carl's been doing a lot of great work in the courts. We've also been going through the executive branch, through the governor's office, basically asking for emergency clemency for our clients, particularly the ones who are medically vulnerable. So there is a general clemency process that I think most people are aware of, that you can ask for a pardon or a commutation, and this is just kind of sped up. So we basically presented the dangers of COVID-19 in the prisons, and like Cook County Jail, Stateville in particular has had an insane level of COVID-19. They have hundreds of people there who have contracted it. I think 5 or 6 deaths at this point. So it's making its way through the prisons as well. So we've been very worried about the safety of our clients who are not only vulnerable, but they're also innocent. So we put together these emergency clemency petitions, laying out the dangers to our clients in prison and also their innocence, and basically saying that they have a plan for release. So the governor's office has been very strict about having to have somewhere to go, not being a danger to the community. And, you know, it's a real uphill battle for us because our clients are convicted of murders and crimes like that, very serious crimes. So not the people you would usually think would be able to be released in this way. But we did have a couple of successes. One of them was a clemency petition that was already pending. So we had a hearing on it in the fall, and it was on the governor's desk already. So we basically wrote a letter requesting that the governor expedite his review and saying, you know, you need to reduce the prison population. All the experts say that you can't social distance in prison. Everyone is very close to each other. They don't have the proper medical care. And, you know, a great way to do that is to grant these clemencies that are already on your desk. So he did grant that for one of our clients who was actually female serving a life sentence. So she originally was sentenced to death and then was resentenced to life in the 90s. So she was never going to get out. And so, you know, we don't know if the governor would have granted her, he actually granted her a commutation. So she's on parole now, but she went from certainly going to die in prison someday to, you know, being out in the world with her family again. So it's kind of a positive that may have come out of all of this pandemic. And then another client of ours was a complete emergency clemency because of COVID-19. He is on dialysis, he's in kidney failure, diabetes, hypertension, you know, all of the risk factors that they talk about. So we were able to get a doctor to review his medical records, and this doctor is a correctional expert at Rikers, which also has had a big outbreak. And he was able to say that our client was at great risk should he contract this disease while he was in prison. So we put that together in a request with his innocence claim, presented that to the governor, and asked the state not to oppose or to support our request. And they did actually support our request, which we were very surprised about, and I think speaks very well to them that they've been concerned about this as well. And he was actually released. So, you know, I was, to be honest, very surprised that they granted that. But, you know, we found out afterwards when he did go, he ended up having to go to the hospital here to get some of his dialysis treatment. And because IDOC had messed up his dialysis treatment at the end, the hospital said he would have died if he had been in IDOC still. So I mean, the stars aligned on that one, and it's been amazing to see both of them out. Now there's been a lot of backlash based on these releases. You may have seen some of that in the news. So there haven't been any releases in the past month or so. And some of that is not entirely accurate. They're lumping together people who served their time fully and just happened to get out during this. They're saying the governor just granted everyone releases. But one of the things the governor did was grant the ability for IDOC to grant medical furloughs. So that was another option that we've been filing for and looking into, is asking that IDOC allow our clients to at least be let out during the pandemic, where they're, you know, in particular danger inside. But as far as we know, IDOC has not granted any medical furloughs yet, and they've been given that ability for about a month. So we don't have a lot of hopes for that. We're still trying with the governor's office, still pushing that, and there's been some attempts through the state's attorney's office too. So that's, you know, the big part of our push during this has been with the state's attorney's office and the governor's office, just trying to get our clients out where we can.
That's terrific. And this may be a good moment to transition to our next clinics. I think some of the issues are thematically related. That's the Federal Criminal Justice Clinic. Take it away.
Thanks, Jeff. So when the coronavirus hit, the Federal Criminal Justice Clinic decided to shift our focus to doing litigation and policy work that would really help our client base during this epidemic. And our client base is people in federal jails and prisons specifically. So since then, we've worked with Congress on legislation that would release more people from federal jails during a pandemic. We've also helped the Federal Defenders National Organization with their policy response. But what we really wanted to do was like focus our advocacy efforts on Chicago. So Professor Erica Zunkel and I reached out to the Federal Public Defender's Office here, and we learned that our former clinic student, Amanda Penabad, who graduated in 2012, was leading that office's response to COVID-19. So from there, our students like really stepped up. They've been totally extraordinary, incredible advocates for clients facing what are now possible death sentences as a result of this pandemic. So I'm going to turn it over for the rest of our time to two current clinic students, 3Ls, Elizabeth Meyer and Allie Van Dyne, and they're going to tell you more about our work.
Thanks, Allison. We're going to give you a brief overview of the work the clinic's been doing more broadly, and then tell you about the specific clients both Allie and I have been working with, one of whom my client has already been released. So when we started this work, one thing that became really clear was that to advocate for our clients, we really needed to know as much as possible about what was happening on the ground. So Allie and I began by compiling anything we could find about COVID-19 outbreaks in jails and prisons around the country and how different jurisdictions were responding to the COVID-19 threat. And the federal defender added our research to pretrial motions for release and other filings.
So our main project, as Professor Siegler sort of mentioned, is researching and filing compassionate release motions for vulnerable people who have already been convicted and sentenced and are currently in Bureau of Prisons custody across the country. And federal compassionate release basically permits a judge to reduce a person's sentence for medical reasons or family circumstances or anything that's considered extraordinary and compelling, which gives us a lot of room to work there. And then additionally, by a stroke of luck, federal compassionate release was just expanded by Congress. So incarcerated people can now bring these motions before federal judges instead of relying on the Bureau of Prisons to grant it, which, given what we've seen of the Bureau of Prisons, was an insane way to do things. So we started by identifying clients who might be eligible for relief by scouring public court records, really getting into PACER, and we looked for possible underlying health conditions, what percentage of the sentence they'd already served. If you've served more of your sentence, we sort of have a better argument that you should be released, and how old they are, since older people are much more at risk for the coronavirus than others. So we wound up taking on 6 clients, and each of us was assigned to one of those cases. And then we worked with Professors Zunkel and Siegler to get in touch with our clients and their families and develop our legal strategy and then ultimately write these motions. And doing this really quickly, I actually was looking back at the timeline on my client's motion and was astounded at how fast we put this all together, has raised a few different challenges. So some of us, like me and Elizabeth, were able to quickly contact our clients and get really important information from them or their families, their friends, sometimes their prior attorneys. And this was really helpful because it allowed us to tell their story with a lot of color to the judge and like really persuade them why our client deserves compassionate release. But other student teams have had a harder time doing that or have encountered other obstacles. So we have a weekly COVID team meeting in the Federal Criminal Justice Clinic to brainstorm solutions to these issues and, keep helping each other out. And then another challenge we've really encountered is how badly the Bureau of Prisons is mishandling their response to this highly contagious virus. And so our job is to convince these judges to overcome sort of this innate trust they have for that institution. And we do that by keeping up with the flow of really excellent investigative reporting on this topic that's been done, and we incorporate that into our motions. And that helps us tell our client's story. And now we definitely want to tell you about a couple of our clients. So my client, Mr. Siegel, he's a man who was convicted of his first ever offense, transporting drugs at the age of 67. So he's an older, nonviolent first-time offender. He was sentenced by Judge Shaw here in the federal court in Chicago to 36 months in prison, which is below the sentencing guidelines recommended, but still quite a long time for a man his age. And then his age, along with his serious health conditions, including high blood pressure and diabetes, make him especially vulnerable to COVID-19. Fortunately, the virus is not yet in his prison that we know of, but we're hoping to get him out of harm's way before it's too late. And it's only a matter of time because COVID-19 is in the surrounding community, and we've seen it sort of make its way into prisons and jails across the country really quickly once that happens. So we filed our opening brief last Monday, which is crazy to me. And the government responded last Thursday, and we just filed our reply this past Monday. And now we're just waiting for Judge Shaw to rule. So things are moving much more quickly here than in an ordinary federal case. Just one thing about the government's response I want to highlight is that they actually argued that our client would be safer in prison, which is sort of a known and proven hotspot for viruses like this, than he would be living with his daughter and her partner in Pennsylvania, which, you know, the strangest part of this process has been arguments like that that totally fly in the face of all the research you've done and, you know, just sort of basic common sense. But I just want to conclude my section by saying, you know, this has been an intense and a vital experience that has shown me how much a lawyer can do, and at the same time, how much we can't, depending on our role. On the one hand, given the shenanigans that BOP has been pulling, you really need a lawyer fighting for you in court and on the phone and over email and with a wide variety of people. But on the other, and Elizabeth will speak more to this as well, there's so much we can't do and we can't fix on our own, and balancing those two sides of the scale is so important, not just for your advocacy, but for your emotional well-being as well. And so with that, I hand it off to Elizabeth.
Great, thanks, Allie. So my client, Mr. Thompson, is also a first-time nonviolent offender. He was convicted of fraud. He's 65 years old and has several pre-existing health conditions that also put him at a higher risk for complications from COVID. His situation was different from Mr. Siegel's because he was incarcerated at Butner, which has been ravaged by a very serious COVID-19 outbreak. So when we filed our motion, the BOP had reported around 50 cases there. And since then, the numbers have skyrocketed to over 200 inmate cases, including 5 deaths. So when I was first assigned to Mr. Thompson in early April, it was hard to get in touch with him. It was hard to get in touch with the facility as well. And we actually learned that our original letter we sent to him was returned to Professor Zunkel because the BOP had determined it wasn't legal mail. And we finally heard from him the night before we were planning to file. So we quickly added information about his medical conditions and personal situation and release plan to our motion. And we also learned that the BOP had decided to send him to a halfway house for the rest of his sentence, which we didn't think was any bit better than being in federal custody because halfway houses have had really similar problems with COVID-19. So learning all this gave us a lot of information, but it was also really frantic to add that to our motion and really personalize it and bring the color we needed to help Mr. Thompson. And we knew that his life was at risk and it became much more urgent then. And we filed our emergency motion for compassionate release. As a backup argument, we argued for him to be released to home confinement. And Judge Dow, who had originally sentenced Mr. Thompson, asked us to submit his release plan and also more briefing about whether he had exhausted his administrative remedies with the BOP. So after we submitted all those filings, I got to attend the telephonic hearing that Professor Zunkel argued, and Judge Dow ultimately decided to send a letter to Butner's warden urging for immediate release. And there ensued a bunch of back and forth about what was happening with the BOP because we weren't always getting up-to-date information. So even though he had a verified release plan, it had been switched to the halfway house. He was moved to a quarantine unit, which was actually him and over 40 other inmates, eventually 60% of whom tested positive for COVID. Luckily not Mr. Thompson. So we ended up filing a status report, and eventually the U.S. Attorney reached out to the Bureau of Prisons and was instrumental in getting Mr. Thompson released last week. So we're very happy he is back from on home confinement, staying with some friends, and there's a picture of him looking very happy to be safe and out of Butner.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much. So we do have a full agenda, so let me move it along to our Immigrants Rights Clinic.
Hi, so my name is Nicole Hallett. I direct the Immigrants Rights Clinic, and I'm going to have a student talk about most of our work. I wanted to just mention briefly one thing that that Victor, who's going to be talking in a minute, isn't going to be able to speak to. It's another team. But we actually have a client who is in immigration detention. He's hits all of the COVID-19 vulnerabilities. He has almost every single pre-existing condition that one can have. He's elderly. We did file an emergency motion to try to get him, out on house arrest while the pandemic was going on. And in response, the government essentially put him in a hermetically sealed room where the only people visiting him are people in full hazmat suits, and then made the argument that he was safer in the hermetically sealed room in the detention facility than he was on house arrest, and the court bought it. So now we're trying to, that was fairly early in the pandemic, and so we're considering whether we want to file an additional motion because the detention facility where he's being held has one of the largest outbreaks of COVID-19 in the whole immigration detention system. And so we think it's only a matter of time before something happens to him. We've been hearing from folks who are working with people who are in criminal custody, either pre-trial or serving a criminal sentence. This is a client who actually finished serving his criminal sentence. He was convicted of giving money to some Muslim charities before 9/11 in the sweep of Muslim men after 9/11, and served over 10 years in federal prison for that. He served his sentence as of October 2017, and the government simply refused to release him, and they are arguing that they're going to carve out a new exception to the general rule that you can't hold people without criminal charges if they've been accused of anything related to terrorism. So we've been litigating that case. So he isn't even being held pursuant to any, constitutional authority whatsoever. So I think we've heard about a lot of successes, but I think some of us are struggling with working with clients, and we haven't been successful yet, and we're very concerned that they're going to get sick. On the other hand, we're doing that work. We're trying everything we can because it could lead to a life or death situation. We've also wanted to kind of try to address this situation from a systemic level or from a policy level. And there's been a team of students that came together in addition to their other work to just work on COVID-19 issues in immigration detention. 4 students have been working on that since the beginning of the pandemic. And I'm going to turn it over to Victor Hollenberg, who's a 2L in my clinic, to talk about what that team has been doing.
Thanks for the introduction, Nicole. It's great to see so many of you guys join us this afternoon. I think the easiest way to divide the work that we've been doing with respect to COVID-19 during the course of the past few weeks is sort of viewing it through the lens of 3 buckets. The first being investigative, the second being advocacy, and the third being client service with respect to clients who we had before the outbreak of the pandemic. And I'm conscious of time, so I'll try to go quickly. But with respect to our investigative work, we've issued a set of FOIA requests or requests under similar state statutes to immigration detention facilities, both here in the Midwest and in California. And we started in mid-March to work with a team at the National Immigrant Justice Center here in Chicago to send out FOIA requests to immigration detention facilities in a number of states in the 7th Circuit, as well as in Kentucky, which is part of the Chicago region for purposes of immigration detention. And as some of you may be aware, the vast majority of detainees in immigration detention are there for civil immigration violations. And, the majority of them have no criminal record to begin with. But a lot of them are being held in facilities that are run by county sheriffs or local sheriff's departments. And so there's really not that much information that was out there about the condition of their detention, when the outbreak began. So we really quickly threw those requests together, have sent them out. Some detention facilities actually released their detainees to ICE during the beginning of the outbreak for reasons that we're still trying to ascertain. But that's been one local prong. Separately, we've been working with Ellis, which is a legal services group team down in San Diego, Tijuana area. And they have been working alongside a whole bunch of groups who have been looking at the the really challenging situations that immigrant detainees are facing in the Otay Mesa and Adelanto immigration detention facilities, which are privately run. And Otay Mesa is outside of San Diego. It's currently facing the single largest COVID outbreak. As of May 4th, there were 123 ICE detainees who had been diagnosed with COVID, in addition to 66 U.S. Marshal Service detainees. And there have been a handful of detainees who have gone on hunger strike, and there's been really extensive litigation trying to get folks out, both at Otay Mesa and Adelanto, which is in San Bernardino County. At Adelanto, which has over 1,200, 1,300 thereabouts detainees, as of earlier this week, only 6 detainees had even been tested. So we just yesterday pushed out some FOIA requests to Department of Homeland Security, CBP, and ICE to try to get more information about what is going on there, because we understand from our partners that there have been a number of punitive steps taken towards detainees who have refused to either sign waivers in exchange for PPE or who have otherwise tried to raise awareness of the situation that's going on in those facilities. And there have been a handful of lawsuits arguing for preliminary injunctions with TROs. A few weeks ago, Judge Hatter in the Central District of California issued an injunction ordering the release of medically vulnerable detainees at Adelanto. And just last night, the Ninth Circuit pretty much put a hold on that and only was requiring the facility to comply with CDC guidelines. So there's a lot of work that has yet to be done there, and we are really trying to go as quickly as possible there. With respect to advocacy, the CDC promulgated an interim final rule towards the end of March, invoking it's a purported authority under a fairly obscure public health statute from the early 40s. And we, in a matter of about a week and a half, threw together a comment which argued that not only was the CDC placing probably too much reliance on an authority that had never been invoked before, and probably misconstruing the scope of its authority, but in what the order essentially did was to try to get CBP and Border Patrol to immediately return any undocumented person found at the border in the United States. But the way the order was phrased was essentially targeted at undocumented folks, asylum seekers, and refugees, and it only applied to land borders who were not provided with any process. In contravention, we argued, of the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, as well as the United States obligation under international law, including the refugee statute, the Refugee Convention, and the Convention Against Torture. About 200 comments were submitted from a bunch of organizations across the country, so we're hopeful that when the final rule itself is promulgated, that'll account for some of the deficiencies that the interim final rule very clearly demonstrates. And there was actually a story in the New York Times published on May 3rd with respect to Stephen Muller of the White House, who story essentially looks at the course of public health authorities being used for immigration purposes, and this particular rule was mentioned at some length in the piece. And lastly, just with respect to client service, Nicole already touched on some of this. We obviously have a number of clients in a variety of different situations, not just in immigration detention or in the United States, but also overseas. And court closures have had an impact on discovery, on our ability to connect with outside counsel, and opposing counsel. And so under normal circumstances, we're obviously incredibly conscious of the importance of connecting with clients, but particularly in times like these, we have clients who are separated from their families overseas, who have children here in the United States, who may or may not be able to work. And so really just putting a human touch on representation is something that we've been especially conscious of. And there's a lot of work yet to be done, but we're very much on it. And it's a very quickly moving area, and so we're doing our best to stay abreast of any developments.
Victor and Nicole, thank you so much. I'm going to move it along now Our next clinic is the IJ Clinic on Entrepreneurship.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be with you in a virtual sense. The IJ Clinic on Entrepreneurship is general counsel for low-income entrepreneurs, but we're also a watchdog and kind of a booster for low-income entrepreneurs. So when this started really taking shape in Chicago, it was really right at the beginning of spring break, right? So that's when our wheels started turning about what we could do, not only for our clients who would be facing unknowable kind of disruptions to their small businesses, but also to the community of entrepreneurs that we are trying to look out for and advocate for. Amy Hermalik in the IJ Clinic, the other attorney, had the idea of putting together a website where those small businesses could connect with Chicago customers if they were still, operating, if they were still selling the things that people would be looking for while they started sheltering in place or staying at home. So we did create that website, and it's called shopinplaceshy.com, and I am trying to share my screen, and I am not finding the right spot, but you can look up shopinplaceshy.com and you can look for different businesses. I think that no matter where you are in the country or the world right now, a couple of our clients are on there and you can look them up. Chicago Detours is one, offering virtual tours. So every day, kind of around the happy hour, you can take a free virtual tour of Chicago. Haji Healing is another client of ours that Katie, who's about to speak, has worked with. She's offering yoga classes and other kind of wellness services on Zoom. And there are all sorts of businesses, small local businesses, that are really trying to meet the demands of customers who are trying to stay safe at home. Also,
Beth, I'm going to share my screen so they can see the website. Please continue.
That's awesome. At that, the project of putting that website together, you can click on business types and see a bunch of different categories, and small businesses can add themselves to the site. Students volunteered during spring break to help us put together the initial version of this this website, and so that made a huge difference for us getting it launched really quickly. Also during spring break, students rose to the challenge of putting together memos on the loan programs and the laws that were changing so quickly, as has been a theme for this entire presentation. If you see the blue bar up on top of that screen, you can click there, business owners can click there and learn more about the resources we put together. And Katie Karnash is going to talk about her role as one of the volunteers during spring break who put together memos for small businesses to learn about what was going on.
Thanks, yeah. So like Beth said, over spring break, we wanted to get some resource guides together for both our clients, but also all small businesses in Chicago to give them information about different government support programs that were being implemented, and also different regulatory requirements that were being implemented for Chicago. So there were lots of grant or loan opportunities, some tax payment deferrals. We wanted to kind of get all that information in one place. And then also requirements about paid sick leave for employees, both. There's a Chicago statute that regulates that, and then one of the first federal responses to the coronavirus had rules about paid sick leave for employees for small businesses. And then we also wanted to, we knew that these small business owners were not only worried about their business, but also about their employees. And so we wanted to include information about the Illinois unemployment benefits that they could share with their employees, the Illinois Department of Employment Security expanded some of the benefits due to coronavirus for people who had been temporarily laid off. And so we wanted to get that information out to them as well. And then as we've been working with our clients this quarter, a lot of them are working on pivoting their businesses in response to this, obviously. For example, we have clients who are interested in starting to make masks and sell masks. And so we're working on the regulations about that from the FDA, and we're hoping to be able to share that information on our on the resource page so other small businesses can do those things and make sure they're in compliance with all of the laws that they need to be in compliance with.
Thanks, Katie. Jeff, you can get out of there at this point. But like so many of the other students and attorneys have mentioned, we're trying to advise clients and the community as these laws are developing and trying to keep up with it. And all of our students on all of our teams have been rapidly catching up with the changing law and grappling with guidance and rules that have been put together very quickly and are not clear, including the rules about whether a mask is regulated by the FDA as a medical device and so on and so forth. I'll just mention a couple more things. We put together a lease template, an amendment to a lease, a very simple, easy to read amendment to a lease so that small landlords and small businesses could have a document that they could use to forgive or reduce rent during this time. And we've been working on broader policy issues too in our role as a watchdog. The city just about a week ago introduced a new ordinance that says that the city can take away a business license if a business isn't following emergency procedures. As you can imagine, it's a challenge for these small businesses to even know what the emergency procedures are, much less to comply with them. They're not always clear. So we're working with aldermen and city council to try to explain that and bring the perspective of the small business who's struggling through this so that they don't create these really harsh and scary penalties. And as we speak, one of our students is working on a comment to the FDA about, or the SBA about the rules for that paycheck protection program that you've probably heard about. Even though the funds were used up extremely quickly, we want to let the SBA know that we think the rule that they added that made people with criminal records ineligible is inappropriate and unfair and frankly foolish. So we're working to make sure that people with the dreams of entrepreneurship, no matter what their background, are treated fairly by the law and have the chance to make things work and make a living even in this time.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move it along now to our Innovation Clinic, Emily Underwood.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Underwood, and I'm the director of the Innovation Clinic. We work with startups and high-growth startups and venture capital firms. And so as you can probably imagine, very much like the IJ Clinic, we've been doing a lot digging into the FFCRA, the CARES Act, the Main Street lending facilities that have been made available, and associated legislation, in particular, helping our venture capital clients think through how they can navigate the SBA affiliation rules, which when applied on their face to many startups that have venture capital funding, would make those venture capital funded startups ineligible to get Paycheck Protection Program funds. So luckily, many of our clients were able to come up with cogent arguments for the SBA as to why these VC-backed startups actually should get PPP funds with some success. We had a good number of clients who got those. So that was great. Fast-moving environment, obviously, as all of that was happening over spring break. And as Beth mentioned, these funds went like that. They were gone. So that's been one area that we've been focusing on. Another area, as you might expect, there's been a lot of innovation, which is our bread and butter as a result of this COVID epidemic. A lot of people coming up with inventions and new ways to fight this disease that we had not previously had. And in light of that, we were lucky enough to have Rob Weinstock from the Abrams Environmental Law Clinic refer a project to us for one of those new devices. And so I will turn it over to our student, Neil, to talk a little bit about the project that we are doing for them.
Thanks, Emily. So our client is a 211 nonprofit in a major US city, and some background on what this organization does. I don't know if you're all familiar with the 311 in Chicago, but it's basically a phone number run by a nonprofit that people can call into to get information about services in their area, like food, clothing, shelter, employment, disability support, and the like. So our client is a 211, just different number, different city. And it collects data in a lot of different circumstances, but is obviously doing that now with regard to COVID. And when it gets calls from people asking about, what type of unemployment support or food support or treatment is available in their area, they collect data. And what they're hoping to do now is to be able to get that data. For example, they have a lot of data on how many people are contacting the helpline per county, doing some work on tracking how many people report symptoms per county, testing availability per county, and the like. And they're hoping to find a way to distribute that data in a way that's accessible to the public. So what they've been doing is using pre-existing Microsoft software they have a license to, which provides kind of modules for creating graphs and tables and interactive maps. They're taking those modules and arranging them into different dashboard templates. They hope that when published and when the data is included will be accessible for the public to understand how COVID is developing in the areas around them. And so they came to us with, I think, two questions. One, trying to understand what type of intellectual property they might have in the templates they're creating. And we did some initial research into that, and we got some consults with Professor Picker, which were extremely useful. And we think there might be a copyright in the kind of selection and compilation of the templates that they're creating, and the selection and compilation of the data. And from that point on, we're hoping to help them create a licensing agreement of sorts so they can start distributing this template to other similar nonprofit organizations that they can then use to take their own data and distribute it to the public. So right now we're working on drafting that agreement so that our clients can preserve its intellectual property, while also making sure that this database gets out to as many people as possible.
And as I'm sure is the case, as you guys have all heard with many of these projects, of course, time is of the essence. I think one of the biggest challenges that we've all had in fighting the COVID epidemic is actually this data problem, that we have all this data being collected by different agencies, it's dispersed, we're not sharing it appropriately. We need a certain amount of data in order to analyze it appropriately, to really understand how this virus is spreading and where we should be targeting our efforts to fight it. And so we hope that getting this dashboard licensed out will be the first step in more broader data sharing across agencies that are in a position to do so.
Terrific. Thanks so much. Well, we have two clinics still to hear from this hour, so let me turn it over to the International Human Rights Clinic.
Hi, everyone. My name is Claudia Flores. I'm the director of the International Human Rights Clinic, and I co-teach it with Nino Garuli, who is also on this call. I'm just going to give you a very brief overview, and then Eric Singerman, one of the students in the clinic, will talk about one of our particular projects, prison labor, in which we have incorporated some work on COVID. Our work is global. We support advocates to advance human rights throughout the world. So as you can imagine, this crisis has impacted our work very dramatically. country. We were working on a project this year in Tanzania, working with lawyers that were trying to bring strategic litigation cases to the country's highest court on First Amendment issues. And you may or may not have heard that Tanzania is in a very significant upheaval right now. There are reports of midnight burials and denials that the pandemic is spreading, and the government there seems not to really be taking a very forward approach to fighting the pandemic. And so we've been working with Freedom House and with our partners there to try to support them to at least preserve civil rights in this context. We also have another project this year with the International Labor Organization in which we were analyzing the migrant wage gap, the gap between migrants and nationals that exists in almost every country. And one of our target countries was Spain, and the Spain International Labor Organization office was disbanded basically before spring break when we were supposed to travel there to conduct some of our fact findings. So the students have pivoted, and we've been conducting all of our interviews that we were supposed to conduct in Belgium and Spain over Skype. So it's been a bit of a complicated spring quarter for us. So what we've done on COVID is we, about a quarter to a third of the clinic's work is usually US based. And this year, the project that Eric will be talking about is a report that we're writing with the ACLU on prison labor in the United States. And what we've tried to do is essentially continue to use the international human rights mechanisms to hold the U.S. accountable for the way that it's not responding to the COVID pandemic in a human rights oriented way. And then also to advocate within the United States that human rights be part of the calculus and the kinds of approaches that state governments and that our federal government is taking. So one of the student teams, in addition to their regular project, has been working with the U.S. Human Rights Network, which is a network of about 50 organizations in the United States that do human and civil rights work. And the United States was actually up for its Universal Periodic Review. It was supposed to happen this spring, and now it's been moved to the fall. The Universal Periodic Review is the process through which each country is assessed for their compliance with all of their international human rights treaty obligations. So it's kind of the big review that takes place by the Human Rights Council of each country. And we've been working with the coalition of US-based organizations to make sure that the system that's going to be assessing whether or not the US is complying with its obligations understands how the US has been responding to COVID. So we're members of the detention working group, and the students in the clinic, along with the Community Justice and Civil Rights Clinic at Northwestern, essentially drafted the recommendations of that working group on behalf of the working group that were then submitted to the various country representatives to the UN. So there were about 100 country representatives that attended a conference call in which the members of the US Human Rights Network informed them about the failures of our healthcare system, about the way in which poor and disenfranchised people are being disproportionately impacted by COVID, about the lack of coordination within the government, and essentially all of the various fissures that are becoming very clear in the things that don't work in our country. So I will turn it over to Eric, who will talk about the prison labor project that the clinic has been doing and how we've been doing COVID work within that project.
Hello, everybody. It's really nice to see other people. So for the past 18 months, the clinic has been working on a report on prison labor. And one of the reasons something like that takes 18 months is pretty much every prison system and even individual prison is almost like its own fiefdom. And it's really difficult to get systematic data on what's happening in prisons and specifically with prison labor. So a huge part of the report, so we've been doing this for 18 months, and a huge part of what we've been doing with COVID is just trying to shine a light on what is often a really opaque problem. So to understand, I think, why COVID and prison labor combined is such a problem, it's just necessary to understand a little bit about prison labor specifically. So across the United States, there are about 900,000 prisoners working in some sort of labor program. And a vast majority of those people are just working to keep the prisons running on a day-to-day basis. So they are serving food, they're working in the laundry, they are mowing the lawn, they're doing ridiculous tasks like picking up cigarette butts behind the prison. But then a small minority of those 900,000 people are working in programs that I had no idea existed before I started working in the clinic. So these are a weird artifact of the New Deal. And these are government-owned corporations that employ exclusively prisoners. So in Illinois, we have Illinois Correctional Industries. That's a government-owned corporation that employs exclusively prisoners. And generally, when a state agency wants to buy something, it needs to go first to this strange government-owned corporation. So when Governor Pritzker became governor, for example, and they needed to get new letterhead that says, you know, like J.B. Pritzker on the top of the page, they would go to Illinois Correctional Industries and you would have prisoners doing this work. So what does that have to do with COVID? So prisoners working in these government-owned corporations have been producing PPE, they've been producing masks, they've been making hand sanitizer in New York. You might have read about this. It was kind of insane. There was a provisional plan to have prisoners dig mass graves if the pandemic got worse in New York City. And this is not just limited to New York, it's happening across the nation. Florida, Oregon, Texas, at least 14 or 15 other states are using prison laborers to make essential equipment. So why is it a problem? There are kind of three chief reasons, as the folks in the Exoneration Project said already. Prisons and jails are pretty much the epicenters of the pandemic right now. In Rikers Island in New York City, for example, the rate of COVID infections was something like, I think 7 or 8 times of New York City's, and I think 90 times that of the rest of the country. So it's really just, I mean, it's out of control in prisons and jails. I think 4 out of the 10 worst outbreaks have been in prisons and jails. The second big reason is that prison laborers are not given access to the protective equipment that they're making. So prison laborers are making these masks and hand sanitizer, but they're otherwise living and working in squalid conditions in which they cannot protect themselves. Kind of the third big reason, which I'm trying to discern from my really just terrible handwriting. Oh, this work is coerced. So in California, for example, we were talking to someone who was telling us that if you refuse to do this work, you can accrue disciplinary violations. You accrue enough disciplinary violations, you can end up in solitary confinement. And this follows a general trend that's often the case with prison labor, that it is physically coerced, and it's also economically coerced. Generally, prison laborers are paid cents on the hour, and this work is going for 100 times that. So you can make a whole $5 digging mass graves. So what has the clinic been doing? So we've been working with the ACLU on this report throughout. We have been trying to lobby states and governors to both protect prisoners in general and prison laborers specifically, by just mostly shining a light on this, because again, like prison labor really often happens in the dark, and we are trying to make that system a little less dark.
Thank you both so much. To wrap it up for today, let's hear from the Corporate Lab Clinic and Josh Avertine.
Sorry, I was on mute. Hey guys, it's Josh Avertine from the Corporate Lab. My colleague David Starfus isn't able to make the call today, but just a broad overview of what we do. We serve mostly Fortune 500 type companies, think large, national, international. A lot of our clients are retail, which has posed unique issues for the COVID pandemic. We have some clients that are also essential services. So between the two, we've been juggling a mixture of projects relating to what essential services must do in order to maintain social distancing requirements. We have on both ends of the spectrum with purchase agreements. We have clients who are primarily purchasers wondering whether a force majeure allows them to get out of a contract. We have clients who are primarily suppliers wondering how they can argue against a force majeure event having occurred. We have one client in particular who's a sports agent who's wondering about whether certain aspects of NFL contracts will toll during the delayed season. I think that Connor and Sean Kemp are going to talk about that. Wary of the fact that we have little time, so I'll turn it over to Sean Kemp and Connor Harvey to briefly discuss.
Thanks, Professor. So as Professor Avertine was saying, given the wide variety of clients the lab has, our team has had the opportunity to work on projects for businesses on both sides of the essential and inessential question. So we've worked on force majeure contracts or force majeure research projects on my team, as well as other alternatives that companies could seek relief under in a similar vein, such as impracticability or suspension agreements. We've also dipped our feet into immigration a little bit, working on a way to overcome the travel bans, particularly for non-immigrants who might need to travel. We have one client in particular who's an essential business that requires travelers from the Schengen area to come in periodically, and right now that is not possible. We've also prepared research for the duty of care for end users on peer-to-peer software programs. And overall, we've just seen a lot of feedback from clients who are looking at how COVID affects their business, and each business is being affected differently. And it's been an interesting way to get an uptick of work through the lab, and I'll let Connor take it from here.
Good afternoon, everybody. Like Professor Averton said, a lot of our work has focused on force majeure provisions, and not to pat the corporate lab on the back, but when we saw the COVID virus going on in China and kind of the initial lockdowns they did, we thought, you know, it hasn't affected companies here at home yet, but a lot of these Fortune 500 companies have supply chains that run through China. And what if a lockdown happens and it stops, you know, them from getting goods? How does that affect the contract and things like that? So early on, even before the lockdown started here, we thought about advising clients to include epidemics, pandemics, public health emergencies, things of that nature in force majeure provisions, which virtually no client has done because we haven't had anything like this, at least in 100 years or so. So that was something we started on, and we're continuing to do that. And then there's some clients, Professor Averton mentioned this sports agency that has, interestingly, NFL and NBA contracts, a couple dozen of each, player contracts. And these player contracts in the NBA have a force majeure provision, and they're going through collective bargaining, figuring out how that's all going to work out. But weirdly, the NFL contracts don't have any force majeure provisions. They don't have the season's delayed, and they don't have any indication of, do these contracts toll for the year? The players don't want them to toll because that's going to be their livelihood. That's their chance at making a lot of money in the future. The season, they don't want them canceled. The season doesn't want them canceled because then that throws everything into an upset. So both parties want them to toll, but there's nothing explicit in the contract about tolling. There's no force majeure provision in the contracts at all. So we examined a couple labor doctrines. It seems like nothing applies. There's some similar kind of analogies you can draw to oil and gas, but for different reasons, it's like very different and very tangential. And it looks like the main thing that a court would do is look and say like, oh, this is like impossibility or frustration of purpose or something, but for reasons discussed, neither party wants that to happen. And so it moves into kind of collective bargaining and what parties are going to do there, and kind of advising the client on less like contract strategies, because the contracts didn't anticipate this at all, but what kind of agreements they can reach and how to approach those types of situations.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you all. Well, we've reached the end of our hour. I want to thank all of our presenters today. It's very educational and inspiring. Terrific work, everyone. And thank you for all who attended today. It's great to see all your faces, and thanks for joining us for this session. I'm going to wrap it up now, as I know we all have to run. Thank you again, everyone. Be safe and be well.